To this discussion now, National Treasury has sought to stress that Operation Vulindlela has made in the past 4 years to help accelerate economic growth. This is what was meant about this project management office. The presidential initiative has given feedback on plans to mitigate, for example, the energy and logistics space. That's where some of these interventions have gone. So where are we in terms of the GNU talks, and could they derail this important office? Let's speak now to the man who heads Operation Vulindlela, Rudi Dicks, who joins us now. Rudi, good evening to you.
Thanks, Rudi.
Thanks for your time. Good to see you. What is Operation Vulindlela for those who may not know it, and what necessitated its establishment in the first place?
No, absolutely. Operation Vulindlela really is a joint initiative between the Presidency and National Treasury. It is bringing the core center of government together to be able to primarily look at what are the structural impediments to growth, to economic growth. And in its first phase, as we've been doing at our conference and in our report that we've launched a few months ago, those structural impediments were largely around constraints within the network sectors. The network sectors, as you've identified, energy, for example, logistics, the visa regime, water, for example, and telecommunications. So the first phase was to focus on those particular sets of reforms. And ultimately, what the structural reform program is intended to do is to create inclusive growth, is to create investment, and is to create employment. We need to move from the kind of growth levels that are really mediocre to much higher levels of growth. And the structural reform program is one of those interventions that is intended to up our growth rates.
Yeah. I mentioned the former deputy governor of the Reserve Bank at the opening of this hour, Kuben Naidu, and his words were at this event that you were at yesterday. The country was literally on the edge of falling off a precipice, quote unquote. Explain to us exactly what was happening at the time of the formation of Operation Vulindlela, in plain language, because I believe this was also at the height of the COVID pandemic.
No, this was in the context of the energy crisis. So in 2023, Chloe, was the highest level of energy constraint. Simple terms, 116 terawatt hours. This is the massive economic impact, as you could see coming through in the growth figures. Yeah. And I think just to contextualize Kuben's statement, he basically said that the work that Operation Vulindlela done, particularly the implementation of the Energy Action Plan that was announced by the President in July 2022, the establishment of the National Energy Crisis Committee, the involvement of Eskom and, of course, the private sector in trying to collectively work in resolving the problem. So there were two aspects. First, immediately trying to secure energy, and secondly, trying to build a long-term reform program that could secure energy for it. And I think although 2023 was our darkest, if one could say, darkest year of the highest level of load shedding, what we did do is create the confidence and a whole set of measures that are being implemented today that has seen the results of that work in 2023 coming forward. And I think that was the most important part. Yeah. So although we didn't see load shedding end during last year, we created the mechanism, the legislative changes, the reform program that we see right now, and that is the kind of confidence that was important that we were able to create then that we are able to see in 2024.
If you were to sum it up in a sentence or two, how did Operation Vulindlela help undo the blockages so that the energy space could sort of have its lungs breathe again? What is it that you did specifically that helped in that particular space, the energy space?
So the one area, remember there were two aspects of it, Loli. The first was to try and see whether we could support the restructuring and the recovery plan in Eskom. Let's leave that one. That's been an important part of it. But the one thing that Operation Vulindlela did do was create competition in the generation space. So that area was closed. And in our partnership with the Department of Minerals and Energy Resources, we were able to change a particular piece of legislation which was referred to as Schedule 2.
Yeah.
And Schedule 2 basically set a threshold on what we refer to as private generation, right? And we took away the threshold. In actual fact, initially what the minister did was to lift the threshold to 100 megawatts. And that allowed the ease of private projects to register. So we took away the onerous nature of licensing, and so allow them to register. But not only that, we've also allowed them, for example, not to only use it for own use, so they could use the network. So let's just say a developer who built a plant, a 100 megawatt plant, was able to sell his or her energy to many off-takers, right, and use the transmission network. Eventually, at the end of December 2022, the minister removed the cap. Now, that's quite phenomenal. What has been the impact on that? The impact of that is that that had created, and what we track right now, is more than 22,000 megawatts of investment in private sector embedded generation. That's valued at just under 400 billion rand worth of investments. Yeah. That's phenomenal. That was not there 3 years ago. So by Operation Vulindlela, working with the DMRE, changing the schedule, making it possible for private generation to come on stream, making it easy for them to be able to get their plants registered, selling it off onto private sector operators. That has been the most important part in the generation space that we're going to see coming on, and what has helped largely for us to be able to reduce the demand and to be able to limit the extent of load shedding.
I don't mean to get you into trouble here, but I never shy away from controversy. You mentioned DMRE because they are the enabler in that space. Minister Mantashe has not been spoken about in flattering terms. He has been described as more of an obstinate individual as opposed to being an enabler in this environment. How easy or difficult was it to work with him? And is it fair? Is that a fair description of what he has been doing, trying to work with you guys?
I don't think it's a fair description, but I'm not there to say whether the minister has performed or not. It's the president that would have to decide that. I certainly think that this is one of our first reforms, Crowley. And we worked very hard with the minister, with the director general, with the staff to be able to work through some of these things. Of course, there were challenges. Of course, the implications we needed to understand. We needed to understand the cost for regulation, the cost for pricing, what it would do to the network and to the system. But eventually, I think all of us landed on the agreement that we needed to open up generation and allow for private sector. So I think it's been a phenomenal experience, you know, in working with DMRE, in working with the minister, and working with the director general, in being able to get this reform across the line. There's many other reforms that we were able to get across the line. So I'm quite happy to work with the DMRE and with the minister, who of course is the minister then, you know, but it's been an important part of the reform program, and the DMRE has been part of that reform program.
If you were to gaze into your crystal ball, we have not had load shedding now, I think, for over 80 days and counting. Are we on course to finish the year without load shedding, or that's simply too difficult a call for you to make?
It's too difficult. I would not say that we would not see load shedding. I think that in our engagements with Eskom and as the National Energy Crisis Committee, there's a large risk. There's still high levels of unreliability. Unplanned, for example, unplanned outages remains at above 11,000, but they're no longer 18,000 or 20,000 where they were last year. So I think Dan and his team at Eskom have been able to stabilize unplanned losses, and that's important. We need to bring that down to below 10,000. Yeah. You know, so I would caution. I think we're on a good spell. I think we've done a lot through the Energy Action Plan. I think the new leadership at Eskom has gotten that machinery to work well. But there's significant risks that are still there. We need to work through that. We need to manage those risks. And I think that we will eventually, of course, see the end of load shedding, but I think it's probably too early to tell.
Okay. Rudi, I'm going to keep you here. Because you are here, I'm going to get as much out of you as is possible. You're watching News at Prime. If you're just joining us, we are in conversation with Rudi Dicks. He is the project manager at Operation Vulindlela. He's the head of that operation, which resides in the President's Office, if you like. Let's continue the conversation, Rudi, and talk about logistics. That's the one element that still faces major hurdles. How would you describe the environment there now with the new management that's just come into office?
Absolutely. If there are two constraints for our economic growth, fundamentally so, energy, we can't do anything without energy. And of course, to grow our markets and to get our products to markets, logistics has to work efficiently and has to be competitive. So certainly logistics is not as far ahead as energy in the resolution. Two key problems. Again, volumes and being able to deal with some of the challenges that have emerged in the last few years. And the second is the reform program. And that's, of course, creating a competitive and efficient environment in both the rail and in the port space. So it means introducing, again, in the same way we talked about energy, very much introducing train operating companies that are privately owned that can compete with Transnet on the rail network. And that's quite an important reform. I think the leadership in Transnet has been phenomenal with Michelle there, the new GCEO, the appointments of the CFO, the appointment of the Chief Operating Officer, the appointment of the head of Transnet Freight Rail has been phenomenal. Yeah. They have been absolutely in the forefront of trying to do a turnaround strategy, in the forefront of the reform program. We've got a long way to go still. But I think that the point about them wanting to lead on addressing fundamentally some of the challenges that are there, I think that's an important part. Yeah. So we're not going to see immediately changes like yesterday or the day. We're going to have to work through this, and identify systemic challenges in the turnaround strategy that's important, that's supported by the board and by the leadership, but also the long-term reform program to create efficiency and competition is quite fundamental also.
Talking about those problems that still remain, the one area we haven't touched on in both these spaces, energy and logistics, is corruption. I don't know whether your view is going to be that at Eskom, because there's been so much focus on it, particularly from our end as media, we've really shined the spotlight there around corruption specifically. Do you think that is now somewhat under control, whereas in the logistics space, particularly Transnet, that is still a problem? Or am I making a mountain out of a molehill?
No, you're not, really. I think that, let's start off, because I think both these entities were well targeted by state capture. And so, of course, the leadership that inherited post-state capture had to deal with fundamentally a whole set of constraints. You had the operational issues that were there, and then you had, having to deal with the financing and the challenges with that were there. In a kind of post-capture, I think it's going to be quite important for us to be able to ensure that we eliminate corruption entirely. In the Eskom space, I think there's been some fundamental interventions, particularly you've seen announcements on the rest of those who have been operating coal cartels, for example. Yeah. That's quite important, because swapping coal, poor quality coal, coal that is, that is meant for power station, has a specific kind of calorific value. It is, swapped out with poorer quality coal, and that, of course, has a significant impact on the cost of production and on the machinery. So it breaks down, right? Copper cable theft, massive, massive challenges in Transnet. In both interventions, what we have set up is a safety and security work stream that is headed by a very senior person in the SAPS. And we brought in and collaborated with the private sector to be able to do that. So quite interesting what we've seen by deploying boots on the ground, for example, on the coal corridor, which has the biggest incidence of copper cable theft. Yeah. We've seen significant declines as you have a cooperation and collaboration agreement. So we have to target that, So operational performances both in Eskom and in Transnet is significantly impacted by copper cable theft, corruption, various aspects. I think what we are seeing is that it is, as you say, under control, and that we are keeping that as part of the turnaround strategy, very, very important going forward. Trying to focus, it has to be intelligence-driven, it has to have it has to have investigations, it has to have physical boots on the ground, you have to have the justice system working and the criminal system working. And so those are important elements that we've been able to bring together in trying to deal with aspects both within Eskom and in Transnet. And lastly, I think the collaboration with the private sector has been phenomenal. So the president has been doing this collaboration, and they've been brought resources. They've been able to assist us by using private security that they have, particularly on the lines. Because of course, if the lines are damaged, let's just use Eskom, and the coal guys that can't get their product to Richards Bay Coal Terminal, and a cable is stolen, it impacts on their product and the ability for them to get it to the market. So that's been an important part of the collaborative effort.
Operation Vulindlela, let's focus the attention on you now. There is talk that it is a success because, in part, it resides within the presidency. How important would you say the support of the president has been in allowing you to get into spaces, at times forcefully, or perhaps because they know that you reside in that office, there's not going to be too much protestation? I think the Deputy Minister of Finance actually made this point yesterday, that political support is perhaps what has gotten you over the line in many instances.
I don't disagree with you or the former Deputy Minister. But that's fundamental. The fact that the president, this is the president's program. He announces it as his program. He's been the political head and the driver of the structural reform program. We've reported to him, and I think that political cover and support has been absolutely fundamental.
How much resistance have you experienced?
From where?
From either of these spaces, perhaps the very spaces we've just spoken about, energy and logistics, because they are the albatross around the performance of the economy.
So where we require, for example, the president to intervene or to speak to a minister, that's been absolutely phenomenal. The president has not been shy to talk about unblocking some of those things, or convening people so that we're able to have a conversation. So we, where there are, for example, challenges of understanding or moving in a particular direction, or unblocking. So I think that it being located in the president's office, him being absolutely as the head of state, politically supporting it, has been an important part. But don't also discount the role of ministers and the former deputy minister himself. The ministers have been also fundamental. So remember, since this is the two departments who have done this, the minister in the presidency, for example, and the minister of finance has been also fundamentally supportive of this program. So I think what we've gotten is a lot of political support in different layers of government, in the executive. And of course, fundamentally, what has made the difference is that the president has backed this. His president has said that he wants to he wants to see this continue. He's made it as head of the 7th administration, as he decides on his government of national unity, that the structural reform program will remain the centerpiece of the program that he'd want to implement.
If it were for you, yes, of course, the president has pronounced that he would like for this project to continue. So that means that Operation Vulindlela does indeed go into the 7th administration. Is that a firm yes?
That's a firm yes. This will continue. That I think is quite clear. The success of it, the ability for us to be able to do that, continued momentum, potentially new reforms. So I think the president has made it fairly clear that he wants to see the structural reform program continue in the 7th administration.
So a slightly different question, therefore. Yes, Operation Vulindlela overlaps into the 7th administration. However, if it were for you, should Operation Vulindlela be a permanent feature or a permanent structure there so that it helps with these blockages, or do you perhaps capacitate government in order for it to work in this fashion that Operation Vulindlela has been, so that things get moving?
Absolutely. So let's start over the last point. Ultimately, Operation Vulindlela should not be there if there was a well-capacitated government that could deliver on some of these things. We're always going to have that constraint. That's generally not unique to South Africa, clearly. It's all over the world. Delivery methodology is something that has you know, is born out of many countries. UK, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, Kenyan, for example, Tanzania, the US even. So where there's blockages in delivering on particular programs that are important on impact, a kind of delivery methodology is important. So I think that's quite important, that while we do this, we need to develop the capacity, professionalize the public service, and ensure that they're able to deliver. On the first part, which is the, you know, do you want to institutionalize this? Now, this is a risky thing, right? I mean, there are different views of this, but the success of Operation Vulindlela was that it's not formally part of the, well, let's correct that. It's not a structure, you know, like a branch in government, you know. So you need to be cautious about the bureaucracy and ensure that the agility and the ability for you to be able to do the work that you are is going to be quite important. So I think there's probably, you know, somewhere straddling between institutionalization and using the methodology versus the flexibility and the agility for you to be able to perform what you're required to be able to do. And somewhere between that probably is something where we would want to continue sit and be successful. And I think that's really the kind of model that you need to think through. There are pros and cons for either one. You know, others would argue the conference, for example. Many people would argue institutionalize it. But isn't it institutionalizing the methodology in the way you work to fix things, right? Rather than wanting to institutionalize a structure and then you employ 50 people and you know, you guys will raise and say to us, you're wasting public resources, you know, and it's not going to be flexible enough. I think those are the kind of debates that are important, but I think it's the methodology for me and the ability to be flexible, to be efficient, and to be able to work in a collaborative fashion. That's going to be quite critical.
All right. Rudi, you work in the President's office. I'm taking full advantage here. I'm aware that I'm going to put you in a fix, but when is he announcing? When is the cabinet?
Probably. I said you should not ask me that question. It's the President's prerogative, of course, and he will make a decision. As you understand, in your slot early on, you were talking about the formation of the GNU, and I think let's leave the President to make a decision, and he will announce that soon.
I did try. Let it be noted.